Welcome to the second day of the Lisbon Conference. What a pleasure to be here. This is a venue that is very, very close to my heart. 20 years of Lisbon Conference, and it's really an amazing place where you meet a lot of old friends, make new ones, and you really get impressed by the quality of all the discussion. So I hope that we don't fail that expectation today. I'm sure we won't, because we have a marvelous panel of speakers. And I really wanted to thank the ADC. I want to thank Nuno. I want to thank Anna, Miguel, and everyone at the ADC for the very kind invitation to be here. It's really, really a pleasure. And today we're going to talk about merger control, and we're going to talk about the change to its frontiers, and really how the future of EU merger control is being shaped. And we've seen recent developments in merger control that are reflecting a global effort to modernize and make merger regimes more effective, as well as to capture more complex effects and more complex dynamics. And these developments really underscore the growing recognition that there were some limitations to the traditional frameworks for merger review, and also it's highlighting the importance of equipping competition authorities with adequate tools to address emerging challenges in merger enforcement. We cannot look at the EU without also looking at what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic. And we've seen in late 2023, the United States, with the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice, releasing updated merger guidelines, which took effect earlier this year. And these guidelines over there were seen as a way to introduce a stricter scrutiny of transactions with lower market concentration thresholds and expanded filing requirements, signaling, I would say, a more interventionist stance on potentially anti-competitive mergers. The OECD has just adopted in June a revised version of our recommendation on merger review. And meanwhile, the European Commission has recently launched a public consultation to revise the merger guidelines. And the initiative seeks to collect views on if and how considerations such as competitiveness, as innovation, as sustainability, as digitalization, as resilience should be incorporated into the merger assessment framework, I would say aligning enforcement with the broader EU policy goals. So there's a lot to unpack today, and our distinguished panel is here to help us navigate such a rich landscape. And we have with us Elisabetta Jossa, known to everyone, but let me say anyway, in a short summarized version of your bio, that you're a commissioner to the Italian Competition Authority and a full professor of economics at the University of Rome Tor Vergata. You're a research fellow at CPR, Green Bocconi, and you're a member of the executive committee of IRI. And you hold a PhD in economics from the University of Naples, Federico II, and an MSc in economics at the University of York, and we almost coincided there, and a Marie Curie postdoc European Fellowship at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. You've held positions at Brunel University in West London, the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and also the Université de Liège. And I could say a lot more. Daniele Callisti is currently head of unit in charge of merger policy in DG Competition at the European Commission. You joined the Commission in 2008. You served the policy department and then the merger network, where you headed the merger unit responsible for mergers in basic industries and manufacturing. And you're a graduate of the LUISS University in Rome, and you have an LLM from King's College in London and a PhD in public law of economics in La Sapienza University of Rome. And we have Volker, last but not least, certainly not least, and you all know Volker because he was an award winner of the Competition Policy Award of the ADC, of the Portuguese Competition Authority, and you saw him yesterday with his big prize, and very proud to be able to take it home in his hand luggage tonight. So Volker is a professor of economics at the University of Mannheim. He holds the chair in microeconomics. You previously held full-time faculty positions at the University of California, Los Angeles, at the Universities of Oxford and Pennsylvania. You've published in leading academic journals, from American Economic Review to Econometrica to Journal of Political Economy and the Review of Economic Studies. And you hold a PhD from the London School of Economics, and your undergraduate degree is from the University of Bonn. And so, as you can see, we could not have a better group of speakers to lead the conversation today. But before we discuss what we're all here for, which is really trying to understand where the EU merger control is going and the guidelines and so on, it's really important, one very, very important element of merger control is making sure that potentially harmful transactions are subject to notification or are scrutinized. And we've seen mergers that fall below the thresholds, but that still raise competition concerns. And the OECD, in its merger recommendation, includes a suggestion for competition authorities to consider having appropriate tools to review such mergers. So do competition authorities have the right tools and mechanisms to identify and scrutinize problematic transactions? And EU countries have used or tried to use Article 22 referrals as a solution. And then we had the Illumina Grail ruling of the ECJ in September 2024 that held that the Commission's approach, whereby member states could refer a transaction for which they lacked jurisdiction, that was unlawful. So, in short, after Illumina, a member state must itself have jurisdiction over a merger to be able to refer it to the Commission. So EU countries now need to think of other tools they can rely on, and Elisabetta will speak a bit to this, but it goes from calling powers to transaction values thresholds to market share thresholds. And I still remember Frederic Genie, when I was president of the Portuguese Competition Authority, and I was going as a delegate to the Competition Committee, and there was a discussion on market share thresholds, and he would always say, market share thresholds, this is like not objective, very subjective, and etc. And I kept saying it's a good tool, and it actually served the Competition Authority well in these times of changing dynamics and changing paradigms. There are other tools from mandatory notification for companies that have been identified in other processes with market power, or even some of those mergers could potentially be looked at with 101 or 102. So there are quite a few possible solutions. So let me start with Elisabetta, and especially given the Italian experience with the newly introduced call-in powers. So what are the tools that EU countries can indeed use to ensure that anti-competitive mergers are being captured? But what has been the experience of Italy? I think that people want to understand, what's the experience of Italy? What was the process of introducing these call-in powers? Because it's not always easy, and authorities often want to have this power. And I remember in 2012, we thought of having this power in Portugal, and no, keep the market share thresholds. It's much better. That's what the business community would say. So what would you recommend, or would you recommend that other EU countries do the same as you did? And tell us a bit, how successful has it been so far? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, Nuno, and Sofia, Miguel, and the whole competition authority for this invitation to a wonderful conference. I'm really happy to be here. It's a super interesting program. And very nice people. It's a really nice community. Antonio, let me say that some of the positions you mentioned were my positions when I was hired, but then I quit because we have very strict incompatibility rules. But thank you for going through my CV. So yeah, I'm very happy to share at this, in this important time, our experience on this call-in power, which is a tool that we've had now for almost 2 years. And as you mentioned, there is a lot of debate at the moment following the Illumina Grail. So and it's a debate that also touches upon the issue is, if I want to review mergers that fall below the thresholds for compulsory notifications, then how should I do it? Through turnover thresholds, through call-in power, or through other means, okay? So the purpose of my presentation will be very much to say that I think call-in power is working. The fear that some had that it could create legal uncertainty, I think is superseded by the numbers, which I will share. And I think it's a very useful tool also to tackle again the issue about innovation and competitiveness, not only in the digital sector, but also in traditional sectors. So with that in mind, let me go through the tool first a little bit. So in Italy, we have the standard merger control, where companies are obliged to notify to us transactions that meet jointly two thresholds: an aggregate threshold, which is currently in Italy 582 million, and an individual threshold for at least two firms in the transaction that is 35 million. With that law, we review about 70 to 100 transactions a year. And for about 7% of this, we go to phase 2. And typically, we conclude this phase 2 with structural or behavioral remedies. About 3 years ago, we felt that this tool was not sufficient, and then some transactions were going undetected. Precisely as Antonio said, these were really transactions that will fall below this threshold for compulsory notification. It was a time also where there was a really intense and interesting debate in the academia, thanks to papers like Cunningham on the pharmaceutical sectors, thanks to the reports, the Furman reports, Gauthier Lamèche, and so on, which were reporting the fact that large companies in innovative sectors like pharma and digital were very often acquiring startup or innovative small firms. And then this was having a negative impact on innovation, either because the firms will be shut down after the acquisition, or because there will be what is called the reverse killer acquisition, in the sense that the acquiring firm will discontinue its own project, so the sort of level of innovation will go down anyway. With that perception, and the fact as well that we felt that there were markets, local markets in traditional sectors where transactions could rise risk of increased concentration, we felt that we needed to ask for an additional tool. And in Italy, we currently have the power every year to report to the parliament a number of changes in the legislation which we think would enhance competition in the country. And every year, the parliament has to approve this competition law. It's a condition for Italy to receive funds from the Commission within the National Resilience and Recovery Plan. We received then this tool in 2022. It's a tool that, as Antonio mentioned, allows us to scrutinize mergers that fall below the thresholds. And it works in the following way. It's not the case that we can scrutinize any mergers. Some conditions need to be met. In particular, there are three conditions: a dimensional condition, a temporal condition, and a substantial condition. The dimensional condition says that we can scrutinize in the sense that we can ask the firm to notify us the transaction, and then we review it. If the transaction exceeds one of the two notification thresholds for compulsory notification, or if the total worldwide turnover is above 5 billion. That's the dimensional aspect. Then there is a temporal aspect, a condition that we need to meet. That is, it needs to be the case that no more than 6 months have passed since the closing of the transaction. So we cannot review transactions that happened 7, 8, 9 months before. And third, there is a substantial condition that says we can only call in mergers which we think will raise concrete risk for competition in the national market or in a relevant part of it, also taking into account the detrimental effect on the development and diffusion of small undertakings characterized by innovative strategies. As you can see, this third condition says that we place a particular attention to sectors where innovative strategies might take place. So we place particular attention to situations where a large firm may be acquiring a startup or an innovative firm or a nascent competitor or a potential competitor. But this power extends to all sectors, and we are using it in this way. Now, the fear for many was that this calling power will create excessive legal uncertainty. No, the firms will not know if their transaction would at some stage be scrutinized by the authority. So in order to tackle this issue, what we did is we approved, after a public consultation, guidelines that would clarify the type of conditions that will need to be satisfied for us to sort of call in a merger. These guidelines have also the purpose of informing firms as to the likelihood that the transaction will be scrutinized, so that firms can make a self-assessment. Firms can also voluntarily submit to us a request for a preliminary assessment if they are uncertain about whether or not we may call the transaction in. These guidelines provide a number of conditions that are those we look at when we decide whether to call in a merger or not. So the the first three conditions I met are compulsory. Here is really a guideline. And we look at things like the structure of the market, HHI and delta HHIs, and so on. The characteristics of the operators, as I mentioned, for example, if they are large firms in some key sectors, the nature of the activity carried out by the undertaking and the relevance for consumers, the importance of innovative activities and competitive constraints exercised by one or more undertaking beyond market shares. We are particularly careful if, as I mentioned, the transaction involves a startup with significant competitive potential, or, and I'm very happy to have here Chiara Fumagalli, who with Massimo Motta pointed out at the importance of looking at this, whether, for example, the value of the transaction is particularly high compared to the acquired undertaking current turnover, because that was shown to be a key factor in understanding when a potential killer acquisition might take place. We also look at whether the firms have access to significant assets, such as material infrastructure, data, or intellectual property rights. So with this in mind, we have tried to sort of inform the markets as to the conditions under which there is a possibility that we will call the transaction for review. So what do the data tell us? It's been now almost 2 years, and we have data about the number of voluntary notifications that have been submitted, and numbers on the number of notifications that we have reviewed, a number of transactions that have gone to phase 2. And the very first thing to notice is that the data show or suggest that there is not legal uncertainty, because, or at least there is not excessive legal uncertainty. Because if there was legal uncertainty, you will expect that firms would voluntarily submit to us information about their transaction, asking for a preliminary assessment before concluding the transaction. But in fact, that is not the case. The number of voluntary submissions we have received in these 2 years is only 19. In these 2 years, we have analyzed around 39 transactions, but only through preliminary assessment. We didn't ask the firms to submit the merger form. It was really just a preliminary assessment to see whether, according to our guidelines, there was a concrete risk to competition. Only 10 transactions were carefully scrutinized. So in only 10 cases, we asked the firms to fill the notification form, and we reviewed the merger through our standard tools. Out of these 10 transactions, the majority was cleared in phase 1. We had phase 2 for one transaction that was concluded with behavioral remedy. We had one transaction that was withdrawn, and we had one transaction that we referred to the European Commission through Article 22. Very interesting, and then I conclude, is the fact that we sometimes receive information about these transactions, not only by the firms, but also by competitors who are concerned about a transaction taking place, or by third parties who might be damaged otherwise. Many other transactions are scrutinized by us simply through ex officio investigations.
Thank you so much, Elisabetta. And again, I take note that you felt the need to have an additional tool, that call-in power seemed to be working, and that you've tried to find a way, or you found a way, at least in your assessment so far, to tackle the possible legal uncertainty. And at the same time, it's serving well the EU merger control regime in the sense that you have already fed in a merger to the European Commission for assessment, besides the ones that you have directly assessed yourself. So let's move now into this ongoing debate between the interplay between competitiveness and merger control, and often it focuses on the virtues or the lack of virtues of allowing companies to scale up so that, and often incumbents to scale up so that they can better compete at the global scale. However, we see that the ability of smaller startups and innovators to gain scale is a completely different matter from this one. And EVP Teresa Ribeira has recently announced that there will be an innovation shield that is envisaged for the revised merger guidelines to provide assurances to startups and to innovators that EU merger control will not hold up their deals. So Daniela, can you tell us a bit about this innovation shield? What is the shape or the form that it will likely take, and how do you think that this will fit into the new post-Illumina reality?
Well, thank you, Antonio, and thanks to the Portuguese Competition Authority for giving me the opportunity of being today here to talk about these topics. And I have to confess that after having been at the discussions yesterday with such learned and distinguished speakers on the topic of innovation, I think that my biggest contribution here has been to take notes, to take back to the work that is happening. And if I can give a little bit of input on this interesting question that you raised, I think to frame it, let me just take one step back on the debate that has happened in the 5 years prior the current debate on the review of the merger guidelines. I would call them the Illumina years. And I think it's key to make a distinction there between two different problems that we had there. I think that on the academic side, there were papers, some of them were mentioned by Elisabetta just now, others, but many others that touched upon the issue of the impact of mergers on innovation. So there was a debate happening in the academic debate, whereas as an enforcer, and let me also clarify that I speak on a personal capacity today. On the enforcer side, there was a lot of emphasis on the jurisdictional aspects of things. So you had a debate on the substance of the impact of mergers on innovation, and in parallel, a bigger debate by the agencies on who should get these deals, how should we get those deals, how can we look at those few transactions where there is a problematic impact. And I think that the two debates have been a bit conflated for some years, because I think that the second question with the Illumina saga, etc., took prominence. And as many of you know, the Commission thought that it had a tool in the regulation to do this. It started to use this tool in cooperation with National Competition Authority to use this tool, but the court said that we couldn't. So those years are over. So what's happening in that space is that member states have taken the relay. And the Italian Competition Authority is one of those that is at the forefront of the debate. I think in discussions I now hear about the Italian model. It's becoming something to be proud of as an Italian. But there's other agencies that are trying to tackle this jurisdictional issue. And what that creates, as Elisabetta mentioned, is also a debate on the uncertainty and the need to provide certain elements of guidance on the jurisdictional aspect of when we will look at this. In parallel, what's happened is that the debate on the substance has continued, but there's still a lot of confusion, I think, in the broader competition community about these killer acquisitions and what they are. And it's ironic, in my view, that when you look not at the Illumina, the jurisdictional saga and the judgment, but the Illumina decision by the Commission, those hundreds of pages, that's not a killer acquisition. The Commission did not allege that Illumina was acquiring Grail to kill an innovation or to reverse kill something they had in the pipeline. It was a different detrimental effect of innovation that the Commission alleged in that case. That was essentially that you are a large incumbent company in a market, and in a market that is not your own, but it's south of your market, you essentially pick a winner while there is an innovation race. And that will be detrimental to innovation. So what is a killer acquisition? Well, there's an easy representation is, company A, which is very large, buys company B that has an innovative pipeline or potentially a new product, and discontinues it, or continues it and reversely kills its own pipeline, or discontinues it, or gives it another outlet. And I think if you look at the case practice, where as agencies we have had to basically detail this, you will not find a lot of precedents. So I come to the answer to your question. In a moment where we are looking to review the merger guidelines with a focus on substantive parameters, on more dynamic assessments, and on a stronger emphasis on innovation, I think as people who all depend on where we should go, I think the big question is, how do we define these problematic situations? But also, how do we then conversely explain what are non-problematic situations? And in the current guidelines that are out there, if you look at more static criteria, you have clear boundaries, I would say. We have initial indicators which can be market shares. You have a sort of safe harbor that is in the recitals to the merger regulation. You have a presumption of dominance above a certain level. You have HHI metrics. You have different qualitative criteria to gauge a little bit where the problems can be. We do not have the same for dynamic effects at the moment. So that's a key focus of our work. And what Vice President Ribera said is, we will take this opportunity also to give some clear guidance to what is not problematic, for the same purpose that Elisabetta was mentioning, to give certainty on all those transactions that happen in that space that we consider non-problematic, that they will not have a competition problem. So the national competition authorities are looking at it from the jurisdictional angle as well. We are also aiming to provide some substantive guidance on what is not a problematic deal, and she called it the innovation shield. It's a safe harbor, essentially. And just to conclude, I think in the debates, often you hear, from startups, we don't see a lot of killer deals in this space. And if you look at the track record of the agencies, as Elisabetta was mentioning, national agencies, but also the Commission, neither do we. So I think that's why we have taken up the invitation of stakeholders to give some clear guidance on what is not problematic, to build a safe harbor, a shield in our guidelines.
That's very, very interesting. And again, it's curious for someone that has worked on mergers for many, many years. And when you work on mergers, you realize that most of the mergers that you're going to assess are not going to have necessarily a competition concern or a significant competition concern. And you end up having, I typically used to say that it's 5% of those mergers that you clear with remedies, and then you have about 1% that you prohibit. It seems that in this space, it's also likely, as we've seen from your experience, that most cases will be cleared, and then there will be a few that will be with remedies or may eventually have some kind of issue, could potentially be prohibited. So it's quite important to ease the mind of those that are doing these deals and explain what is and what is not, especially what is not problematic, and they can be comfortable that they would probably not even be scrutinized by the competition authorities. So let me move to Volker. We're starting now to talk more about calling powers, the importance of innovation, startups, innovation, etc., the innovation shield, and indeed. So first question is, do you think that indeed not having the right tools to make sure that we scrutinize these mergers, the below threshold mergers, do you think that this is relevant to actually look at not being able is an issue, is a problem, not to assess not being able to assess market dynamics and innovation. And then let's move a bit further and start talking a little bit about innovation and how can we ensure that we're really giving sufficient weight to the innovation element in merger control regimes. What are the key issues that should be in the merger assessment? But at the same time, how do we deal with the uncertainty and the prospective nature of merger control?
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much to the Portuguese Competition Authority for allowing me here to give my views. So to your first question on these reporting thresholds, perhaps it's sort of useful to remind here the audience of the paper that both of you already mentioned. This is beautiful paper by Cunningham, Ederer, and Ma on killer acquisitions that was published in the Journal of Political Economy in 2021. So it looks at the US pharmaceutical industry and what they look at the so-called killer acquisitions, where some dominant pharmaceutical company buys up some smaller startup pharmaceutical company, and a killer acquisition is an acquisition where then this target firm works on the same kind of drugs, is trying to develop the same kind of product, and after the acquisition, that research is just closed down, is killed. Okay. Now what Cunningham, Ederer, and Ma report is that there is a bunching of these killer acquisitions just below the HSR reporting thresholds. HSR refers to the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act, which sort of introduced these reporting thresholds in US merger control. Right? And so clearly that's a problem if a lot of these innovative startups are being acquired without any scrutinies, and that allows, over time, potentially firms to become dominant or to increase their dominance. By the way, there's also a beautiful paper on sort of similar topic on stealth acquisitions, so acquisitions below reporting thresholds by Thomas Wohlman in AR Insights in 2019. So, what does this mean for the European Commission and the revision of the merger guidelines? I do think that the current thresholds are probably too high, but more importantly, I think the problem is that they just rely on revenues rather than deal values. And often these small companies don't have any or very little revenue yet, right? So I think what clearly should be done is to follow the approach that some other jurisdictions, including Germany, for instance, have taken, and give the European Commission jurisdictions not just based on revenue values, certain thresholds, but also on deal value. And moreover, I should say, deal value, not just if a company buys just a 20% stake in another one, then what I mean with deal value is not just the value of that 20% stake, but it should also implicitly mean how much is the entire company be valued. And and if that's above a certain threshold, then there should be scrutiny, independently of whether you buy a 20% or 50% stake. So that indeed, you prevent essentially a dominant firm from buying a startup in a number of tranches. Now, coming back to your, more big picture questions on mergers and innovation, maybe also let's perhaps step back and think about, how do economists think about the unilateral effects of mergers? So the key conceptual framework is the one that was proposed by Nobel Prize winner Oliver Williamson in a famous paper in the American Economic Review in 1968. And he says that what matters is the trade-off between the market power effect of a merger and the efficiency effect of a merger. Now, the efficiency effect of the merger comes about because there might be complementarities in the capabilities of the merger partners. And so these efficiencies might be quote-unquote static. That's the usual efficiencies you might think about, is that the merger might reduce the marginal cost of the merged firm, or it might perhaps increase the quality of the products being offered. But it could also be dynamic efficiencies. Maybe the merging parties could, in a more cheap way or in a sort of in a more efficient way, engage in research. Okay, so conceptually, there's not anything really different between static efficiencies and dynamic efficiencies. And even these sort of typical static efficiencies are also uncertain. Whether or not a merger might indeed lead to reduction in marginal costs is uncertain, and often also does not realize immediately. So there is some dynamic aspects to it, and so dynamic efficiencies aren't any different. Now, what about the market power effect of the merger? Well, the market power effect of the merger comes from the internalization of competitive externalities post-merger. So if, for instance, as one of the merger partners, think about, should I decrease my price a little bit or not? Well, if I did, this would impose a negative externality on my potential merger partner, which before merger I don't internalize, but after the merger I do, and so that would provide upward pricing pressure. But again, that's conceptually not any different from asking the question of, before the merger, when I decide to invest a bit more in R&D, if that imposes a negative externality on my potential merger partner, then after the merger, that externality would be internalized and therefore would reduce my incentive to engage in R&D. So again, conceptually, there's actually nothing very different when it comes to thinking about the effect of a merger on, prices or quantities on the one hand and R&D on the other. Yes, it's true that the outcome of innovation activities, whether or not a new drug is developed or not, is highly uncertain, and it's in the future. But that's not the question that we have to look at. The question that you have to look at is what are the effects of the merger on the incentives to engage in R&D. And it's this change, the merger-induced change in incentives, that's not uncertain. That we can actually already at the time when a merger is proposed, that we can analyze, and on the basis of that, we can come to the conclusion that a merger may or may not reduce the merger partner's incentive to engage in R&D. Let me also say, we perhaps might come back to this, is what this Williamson trade-off clearly emphasized, that efficiencies should be front and center of any merger investigation, and that, unfortunately, in Europe is not currently the case. It's, at the moment, its efficiencies are just an afterthought, and I think that should be changed, but we might come back to this later. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and really, I think that more and more we're looking at dynamics, looking more at dynamic effects. Of course, we still look at static effects, but it's quite important what you say. So you not only should look at static efficiencies, but also at dynamic efficiencies. And it's true that the uncertainty is there either way, and incentives is really something, capabilities on one hand, and looking at the incentives is quite an important element. And this takes us to, I think you've been waiting to know how the revision of the merger guidelines is ongoing, and there was the launch of the public consultation. So we really would like to have an overview of this public consultation, and what are the key issues at stake, what are the objectives, and what are the key issues at stake that the Commission is currently looking at. So where might we be heading, if you can give us a bit of a glimpse?
Yeah. At this stage, we have a lot of questions. The answers, I hope, will come in a few weeks. But I think that what's important to recall a bit is like the context of this public consultation, because the topics that were staked in the public consultation are likely to be the drivers of the reform, so there's no big surprise there. And also a bit some important feedback lines and what we are trying to do with that at the moment. So the reform, I think everybody talks correctly about the Draghi report as, and its pivot on competitiveness and a number of other objectives as one of the occasions for the reform. But I think that the discussion on the Draghi report came at a moment in time where I believe that if you follow the debate in the competition space, it's been already years, more than 5 years, I would say, that there had been a lot of discussion about potential reform, about potential changes that had to be reflected in the guidance on mergers. So all of this has been taken on board, and I think Executive Vice President Ribera launched a public consultation that was, I would say, unprecedented because of its openness and the fact that it pointed at a number of different elements that are relevant for the review. And these were then accompanied by an apparatus of technical reflection, which was set out transparently for the public to comment, which I think was a very good exercise by the Commission to try to anchor the debate on a lot of topics, but also to put it in the framework of what it means for competition enforcers. And let me give you some examples. You may know that the launch of the public consultation on the reform, on the review of the merger guidelines was accompanied by the publication of 7 papers, which reflected some of the main transformational challenges of our economy that need to be reflected in a more modern competition framework, and also a number of other objectives that have been set out since then. So the challenges that we wanted to discuss were obviously globalization, digitalization, sustainability. And this came on top of the debate on competitiveness, on the Draghi reflection on the scaling up in global markets, and an increased emphasis on resilience. And I think I will not say much on that because we'll touch upon it later. Then, of course, there is what we have been discussing earlier, which is essentially the focus on a more dynamic assessment and more dynamic criteria for the assessment. Each of the papers that the Commission published had an initial policy framework, which set out the main questions of how these are relevant for an enforcer in our world. And then there was a technical apparatus detailing in the current framework, under the current legal basis, how should we understand this concept? What cases have we seen where these problems have arisen? How have we addressed that in the past? Should we do more? Should we change our approach? And then it all ended on questions. And I think that the papers were, I think, a good starter of the conversation. And I think what demonstrates the success of this approach is the fact that we have received in merger control at least an unprecedented number of replies. Between all the different strands of consultation, we got 250 replies. Some responded to more, but we have more than 200 stakeholders that engaged in the conversation from all member states, from outside of Europe, and from a range of different types of businesses, of interested parties, which I have to say, in mergers, it was unprecedented. So I think it's a lot to absorb. We're now absorbing all of this. And I can say that it has not been, it will not be an easy task to give a quick summary of what has been said, because as you can expect, this is a topic that is very important for many different companies and many different stakeholders. And some of the feedback lines go in different directions. But there's one underlying thread that, as I think has been almost unanimous, is essentially true. The current guidelines are old. They do not touch upon a lot of things that have been tested in practice, and they do not address some of these broader strands of the debate that needs to be addressed. But the old guidelines had a framework that was, after 20 years of expertise, predictable. I mean, companies would know in 95% of cases how to apply the framework, how to self-assess under the framework. And as we move into more uncharted territory, I think this is something that we have to keep very much in mind about what we will do in the next stage. And as I said, the topics of the public consultation are going to be the main priorities as we set to give new guidance about all of these concepts and how they relate to merger control. But one important principle is that the legal framework around merger control is not changing. The merger regulation is still there. the legal boundaries that we have remain. So when we talk about some other societal challenges and some other policy priorities, like let me take the example of sustainability, people say sometimes in the public consultation, but you cannot now, how can you now put this in your framework of analysis, etc. I think that's a good example that when you look at what the Commission has done in case practice until now, sustainability is already a reality of the enforcement because it has already affected the way in which demand and supply happen in certain industries, and as such it has become a parameter of competition, it has become a parameter of our assessment, it has become an element of our theories of harm, and also, even if it's not been realized by many, it has become also, in one case at least, an efficiency. There was a partial acceptance of an efficiency related to the circular economy in a case that we have decided already many years ago. I could say the same for digitalization and for a number of other topics that are out there. And we'll come to resilience later. Two final things. On the other more dynamic criteria, I think we take it with a lot of, in a very humble way, that we will be probably the first agency to provide ex-ante guidance on this more dynamic framework. So that is why we have to do it carefully, we have to do it right. And what you do essentially when you have to do this is that you ask for help from your friends. And so that is why I think we are following the public debate. We are doing a study on innovation and dynamic effects, but most importantly, we are continuing the discussion with stakeholders. So there will be 2 workshops with stakeholders and also a high-level conference in Brussels. And in parallel, we will have a continued discussion with competition authorities and other agencies. I'm grateful that the Portuguese Competition Authority, that will be the co-chair of the merger working group, will be hosting all the competition authorities here in Lisbon very soon to have a discussion about the review of the merger guidelines among enforcers, which will be a very important moment of our review. But also there will be an event at the OECD where we will take stock of all the work that also the OECD has done on innovation and dynamic criteria, because there's a lot of work out there. And the challenge for us will be to take this on board and translate it into simple, clear, and predictable rules, which is what everybody is asking for. So the biggest difficulty that I see ahead of us is basically how to make sense of this great complexity, as we heard also from yesterday's discussion on innovation, and make it into simple, useful rules that can be helpful in 95% of cases before you get to that 5%, 3%, 2% of cases where your analysis has to become more complex. And that's the real challenge ahead of us.
Well, thank you so much. And again, I think you focused on what guidelines are meant to do, which is to provide some degree of predictability to the companies. And I'm sure that from the 250 replies that you've received, that not all are necessarily going into the same direction. And I think it will depend a lot on what stakeholders you're talking about, whether it's the business community or if it's competition authorities or academics. But that will be interesting to see. I'm sure you'll be spending quite a few hours over the Christmas and the holidays and the New Year, and I hope that we will have some news relatively soon on the guidelines. Let's go back a little bit to what you mentioned. You said out of those cases that you've assessed, there was one case that went to phase 2, and actually there were remedies on that case, and another one that was withdrawn, and another one that went to the Commission. But can you tell us a little bit of what did you assess? What were the issues that arise in that case or those cases that you will look at?
Yes, absolutely. So as I mentioned, which I think is important, again, to focus on this, whilst the debate was mainly highlighting the need for this review of mergers below thresholds in innovative sectors, either because of killer acquisition, reverse killer acquisition, or just because of the acquisition of a nascent competitor or a nascent firms that had some very important potential innovation in the pipeline or already developed. The power extends also to traditional sectors. Okay, so in these 2 years, we have therefore reviewed and asked for notification, both mergers in innovative sectors and in traditional sectors. The two in the innovative sectors refer to, so in one of those, Honeywell, so in a market for production and marketing of inertial sensors, and the other was NVIDIA buying an Israeli company, RAN.AI, in the market for the production of chips, including GPUs for data centers. So we're talking about A sector. So the first one was closed in phase 1. We reviewed it and we thought they would not raise risks. And the second one is the one that we have referred to the Commission, which accepted the referral. And now it's, there is an ongoing, there will be a pronouncement by the Court of Justice on the issue as to whether the Commission should have accepted the referral or not. Beyond this, we have looked at traditional sectors. Let me say that I think if you look at our activities across these 2 years, you will see already that there have been some adjustments. And now we have a better idea of which traditional sectors would raise a concern for us, in the sense that we have focused, for example, on cases where the firms will have access to a key input or a key infrastructure. So a very good example is the ports sector. Because for us, of course, in the Italian economy, that is an extremely important infrastructure. It's a local market, so you can see how important it is to avoid that there is monopolization of certain sectors. I think I will welcome, and then I leave the floor to others. I think I welcome the Commission giving guidelines on dynamic effects and innovative effects. I think it's extremely important because it's very complicated. We have to acknowledge this. Because we have these two forces, that on the one hand, firms may have stronger incentives to innovate if they expect that they might be bought earlier on by a large firm. So this is the innovation buyout effect, where the acquisition actually has a positive impact on incentives to innovate. Whilst on the other hand, we have this entrenchment of monopoly effect, where for example, instead the fact that the firm is bought by the incumbent will have a negative impact on the market. And we have a number of papers that have shown how in the impact of these acquisitions doesn't need to be looked at only from on a case-by-case or on a static, from a static perspective, because even there are dynamics in the impact that a sequel of acquisitions will generate in the market. And there is a very nice paper by Michele Polo and Vincenzo De Nicolò precisely on these dynamic effects. So at the authority, we have, of course, some experience on dynamic effects, because if you think of all the mergers in the TLC market, those effects needed to be assessed. And we have, therefore, some experience, but the guidelines, they may give more indications, indicators, metrics, or other suggestions will certainly be welcome. And I think it's all part of it.
This is a great segue, because of course you're not talking about what I'm talking now, but you mentioned indicators. And that leads me to my question to Volker, because one of the areas that is being looked at in the the revision of the merger guidelines, is really structural features, it's concentration indicators, and you, Volker, you have a paper with Michael Winston in the American Economic Review, where you say, or you argue, that there is both empirical and theoretical, or theoretical and empirical basis to focus solely on the change of the HHI when we're screening for harmful transactions. And you also say that the current levels are too lax. So what are your views and expectations with respect to structural indicators or structural presumptions in this revision of the merger guidelines?
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to clarify a few things about this paper, because it's often cited and was heavily mentioned in this public consultation process in the US when they revised their guidelines, and I think that paper has sometimes been a bit misused. So let me perhaps first tell you what Mike Winston and I do in this paper. So in the theoretical part of that paper, we look at standard models of oligopoly, homogeneous goods Cournot models, yes, and loaded models of price competition with differentiated products. And as you probably all know, in these kind of models, or in fact, pretty much in any oligopoly model, what you need for merger not to harm consumers is that their efficiency. So what we do is we look at what is the required level of efficiencies that would ensure that consumers are not harmed. And what we show is that in these models, this required level of efficiencies depends on delta HHI, or more generally on firms' market shares, and is independent of the level of concentration, so independent of the level of the HHI. And in the empirical part of the paper, we look at the US beer industry, and you look at sort of estimates from a much sort of more complex, state-of-the-art demand estimation, and sort of find, get similar results, essentially confirm what theory says. So what I should stress, though, is that these required level of efficiencies depend not only on market shares, they also depend on some demand elasticity or demand elasticities. So while that paper shows that on the basis of what you might call sort of typical elasticity levels, that the thresholds in the old 2010 US horizontal merger guidelines are likely too lax, the paper does not support the view that there is a universal value of delta HHI below which a merger is unlikely to harm consumers. And let me also point out, sort of a trivial thing, but it's kind of important, is that of course market shares depend on market definition. Now, in some, for some mergers, there are natural ways in terms of how to define a market. But in other situations, there is not. And when it's not obvious how you define a market, what are you going to do? Well, what you should be doing is the hypothetical monopolies test, or the SNP test. And what you need in order to do this test, well, you need data on diversion ratios, and you need data on market markups. Now, once you have, though, if you do have reliable data on markups and market shares and diversion ratios, then you can do a UPP analysis, upward pricing pressure analysis, which, is actually more informative than just looking at market shares. So, in short, while market shares are certainly useful indicators for the potential competitive harm, especially, I think, in a phase 1 investigation where you might not yet have the time to get all the necessary data, you should certainly not stop there. And clearly, if you can do a UPP analysis or merger simulation, then you should do it, and that's going to give you, it's going to be much more informative than just looking at market shares. So I, despite being the author of that paper, I'm a bit reluctant, to have strong presumptions. I think they're indicators, but that's it. You should do more. So I think
I,
Let me stop here.
in a way, I think that this is the answer I was expecting you to give, and not that I want to. I'm not a player here. I'm just moderating. But indeed, I've always learned that we shouldn't stop at looking at market shares. That we should. This is just the first step. So we can have a look at market shares, but of course there are a lot of other elements that need to be taken into account. But again, we'll see how the Commission is going to deal with this. But I really wanted to move into an area, because of the context that we live in, that is becoming more and more important. And we've mentioned this already today, that there have been growing concerns in Europe about the competitiveness, about the resilience, about the strategic autonomy of Europe. We are living in a world of geopolitical tensions, of supply chain disruptions, of risk of global market fragmentation. And we see industrial policies coming at the forefront. And we know that this is also part of the public consultation. But I wanted to start with Volker, and precisely because, again, you have another interesting paper with Massimo Motta and Martin Peitz that is looking at how competition authorities should do a risk-adjusted assessment so that you take into account the risks of international trade frictions and geopolitical disruptions. Can you tell us a little bit about this? And should, at the end, merger control be more permissive to allow for this competitiveness or resilience, or should it instead be stricter to discount competitiveness, competitive restraints from firms that are in risky countries? But let us know. Or should we stay in the middle? What's the solution there?
Yeah, so what Massimo, Martin, and I are arguing in this paper, which, by the way, is my first and so far only publication in a law journal, is that actually, in the face of geopolitical uncertainty, if anything, merger control should be tougher, should be less permissive. And the argument we make in that paper is actually very simple. So if, because of geopolitical uncertainty, there might be the case that foreign companies may no longer be able to export to Europe. Maybe there's a trade war. Maybe there's another, COVID crisis and so on. Of course, whether or not that happens is independent of a merger that's currently under review. But when a merger is currently under review, suppose we have a merger between two European companies that we are contemplating, then we should not discount the possibility, and especially if there's more than just a mere possibility, if there's a certain likelihood of a negative event happening, it would mean that these foreign companies that would, in the absence of any geopolitical uncertainty, constrain the market power of the merging firms, if they're no longer going to be there, then the merger between these European companies is going to harm consumers in the sense because the market power effect is going to be larger. So similarly, there's been this argument being made that somehow, scale economies would, somehow suggest that the opposite is true. You could also say that, if two European companies are merging, maybe they're going to have, because they have the economies of scale, so the more they sell, so if they sell more abroad, they're going to have lower marginal costs. But it could also be that if then these European companies, because the US imposes trade barriers, if then with some non-negligible probability, they're no longer being able to export to the US or at higher cost, and that therefore their exports are going to decline, that would mean that in the face of scale economies, the marginal costs in Europe are going to increase. And again, that would mean the market, that now the efficiency effect of that merger would be smaller. So again, geopolitical uncertainty of that nature would sort of suggest that actually you should be tougher. Now, of course, an issue that you might be facing is that this more likely than not standard isn't the right way to look at it. And as an economist, I sort of always find it hard why, so the legal profession, jurisprudence, doesn't like the concept of a mathematical expectation, right? So it's this more likely than not, in my view, doesn't make that much sense. If, say, with 60% probability you have no harm but no gain, but with 40% probability you have a large loss, then obviously you should block the merger, right? So I think we need to work on changing that sort of standard, and this more likely than not. But once we do, I think geopolitical uncertainty should lead to a less permissive merger control.
So certainly a lot of food for thought for Daniele here. We will be also reflecting on this. But let me first, before we go back to you, ask a national competition authority, and how do you see this debate that a lot of people saying we should have a more lenient merger control to allow for scale, for competitiveness, for resilience? How are competition authorities addressing these arguments? How are you taking it? In a way, the way you're taking it may also serve as an inspiration or not. We'll see for the Commission.
I'm an academic and an enforcer, so I think you need to look at facts, and there is no theory, no empirical evidence, no enforcement evidence that suggests that any change in merger control that will go towards more lenient merger control will be justified. I think this is quite clear from a number of aspects. As I said, we've had, as John Vickers was mentioning yesterday, it was just a year ago that we were talking about the possibility that the rising concentration in the US first, to a limited extent also in Europe, perhaps was calling for stronger enforcement, not a more lenient enforcement. And now suddenly there is this change that seems to me in many respects just opportunistic, because the theory is very clear. If you want to enhance competitiveness through innovation, then you have to protect the competitive process and make markets more competitive. It's through, Philippa Guillon explained this also very clearly, is the competitive pressure that incentivizes incumbent firms to innovate in order to avoid to be displaced, and is the competitive pressure that incentivizes entrants to innovate in order to displace incumbents. So you need to protect this process so that is through merits that competition evolves. Also, as I said, there is no empirical evidence of any over-enforcement in merger control. There is data that was provided again by some, Tommaso Duso has a paper on this, some very interesting research. In Italy, we looked at our experience. As I mentioned, we have around 6% of mergers that are notified that go to phase 2. By the way, I correct myself, we have 2 phase 2 below threshold mergers that we scrutinized. And also, economic theory will tell you that when you have an objective, whatever it is, you really have to think about what is the best tool to tackle that objective. So when it comes to competitiveness, competition policy plays this complementary role, as I just mentioned. You then have to look, and the Commission has been doing this a lot in all the other strategic documents that have published, that you have to also operate on other fronts. And again, this was also in Draghi reports. So competitiveness also comes through the possibility to access funding. So you need to make that funding more easily accessible. It comes from the possibility to scale up. But you scale up, and again, there is a very interesting report by the Commission showing this, if you have incentives to do so because you operate in a competitive market, and if you don't have barriers to scale up, which means that you, for example, for us in Europe, remove the barriers for the internal market. That is the way to incentivize firms to scale up on top of, for example, investing in education so that firms have access to talent. And the Draghi report, I think, is clear on this. It's true that in the TLC chapter, there was some kind of different argument, but for us it's extremely clear. You don't innovate more just because you're big. There is no theory, no evidence supporting this. With regard to resilience, I really hope that Volker will publish in legal journal more often, because I was just so happy when I saw in such a timely manner a publication that will say something so nice, so clear, so blunt, that if you want to protect resilience, you need perhaps to make merger enforcement stricter, not more lenient, because it means that perhaps a competitive force coming from a country where there is geopolitical risk that, that competitive force may not exercise a competitive pressure in the future. And therefore, if you disregard the competitive force, or you sort of attach a lower weight to that competitive force exerting pressure, you have to be stricter in your scrutiny. And also, resilience is something that you face also by ensuring plurality of suppliers. So again, I see that there is a lot of complementarity between all this. So I'm sure that the Commission will do a wonderful job, because they have this very sort of technical approach. I think the idea of the study is a great one, and we really talk about facts, theory, and experience.
No, again, you mentioned something important, which is, of course, that the merger control regime cannot solve for every single problem, but of course you'll need to find the right balance. And I think that, Daniela, this is what the European Commission is trying to do. But, and you were mentioning the paper from Volker. Maybe it's not just about merger control being stricter or not, is about removing the geopolitical tensions. So let's hope that that is a way to solve the problem. But again, protecting the competitive process, I'm sure that this is in your mind, not jeopardizing productivity, not jeopardizing investment, not jeopardizing innovation, not jeopardizing the need to diversify sources of supply. How do we get to the right balance of having these current calls on scale with all of this that also Elisabetta was...
I will start from something you said before, how do you make sense of all these different replies in the public consultation? And, really a personal insight from my experience as an enforcer, having done, I think, dozens, if not hundreds of investigations, is if you ask resilience question to a company about their own industry, they tell you that the resilience problem is there's too much competition. And if you ask them about the industry that is just above them, they say that there's too little competition. So that is the paradox of supply chain resilience. I mean, and how to make sense of this. I think that it's widely understood, and we try to also detail this in the public consultation, that some mergers can promote resilience, but some mergers can hamper resilience. And to go back to what Volker was saying, and also Elisabetta touched upon, there's reference in the public consultation to actual cases where I'm happy that the empirical cases that we've done match the theory and the paper of Volker, that essentially you have certain industry where some companies tell you, yeah, there are some global players playing in this industry, but when push comes to shove, I need to make sure that a certain very large amount of my input comes from the single market, because I cannot take currency risk, I cannot take, trade disruption risks and all of that. And I think that is one question. Another interesting example is from another case that I cannot mention because I have to check if these quotes were non-confidential, but to give you the gist of the idea, there were two large European players coming together in a transaction that was later cleared. And what some customers were telling us were, if these two players come together, I will need to in my future tender, invite a non-European player to bid to keep this option competitive. So essentially, there is a concentration that can essentially promote entry by supply options, which may be suboptimal in the view of the customer from a resilient perspective. At the same time, there is, of course, a resilience issue that we need to tackle. And I think that for both resilience and competitiveness, I couldn't agree more with what Elisabetta just said. Merger control has a fundamental role to play in these challenges, and that's what we are trying to achieve with the review of the merger guidelines. But working on this, I do not have for the moment the arrogance or the pretense to think that this is the solution, that this is the philosopher's stone that will turn this to gold. We are moving together with other policy initiatives that are around us to address it. And it's true for resilience, where we have other instruments, but it's also true for competitiveness. Now, the Draghi report is very clear that it looks at certain industries where there's a productivity gap, where we're lagging behind. And I did a little experiment yesterday in preparation of my notes, and I asked Lesha, which is the app of Mistral, the AI assistant of Mistral, for the largest companies by market capitalization at the moment. And if you look at the list, if you look at the top 10 US companies that are the largest by market capitalization, something that also Draghi mentions, and you think, why were they so successful? So where do we need to learn? And these are companies that at some point in their inception, they started from a very competitive environment. NVIDIA had 70-something competitors in the gaming semiconductor business. They had a successful idea, and when they reached that stage, they managed to get the funding, the money, and the wide market to scale up quickly to a level where then they became what they are today. So I'm happy that alongside what we are doing with merger control, there has been also an announcement by the President in her State of the Union speech that we will have soon a roadmap for the single market. Because if you look at Draghi, but also at the Letta report, that's also the other fundamental complement. Because we will not have a lot of gains if we remain in many critical industries with our little national ponds where companies, scaling sometimes means market power. But if you have a larger pond, then you have a real pool to scale in a way that is pro-competitive and that can, bring productivity growth.
This is likely the best, and we didn't arrange for this, but I think it's the best way to end this panel because we're out of time. But also, you're repeating what Elisabetta was saying, that indeed making sure that we complete the single markets is the single most important policy that the EU can have right now. All the rest is complementary. And we will be looking very much closely to what you're doing in this space of the merger guidelines, and with a lot of attention, with a lot of interest. And again, I'm sure we won't finish the discussion here. You will continue listening to what stakeholders have to say. And one area that we didn't manage to cover, but Volker said this is center stage, is efficiencies. And again, maybe next time, or maybe in between now and when you publish your guidelines, which hopefully will be soon, the community will still have an opportunity to debate efficiencies as well and how you may look into them. Thank you all so much, and thank to this extraordinary Elisabetta, Daniela, Volker. What an amazing panel. Thank you so much.
Thank
you.